They say the coldest place on Earth isn't the Antarctic, but the empty space beside you where someone you loved used to be. For 75 years, I thought I understood that cold. I was wrong. The true Arctic is the moment you realize that the people who should love you most are the ones handing you a one-way ticket into the dark, smiling as they do it. My story isn't just about a house or money. It's about a silence that lasted 50 years and the scream that was waiting at the end of it. If you've ever felt invisible, ever been underestimated, then you know what I'm talking about. Stick with me. Follow, like and share this story, because we're about to expose the truth, and press that notification bell so you don't miss a single part of this reckoning. It's just getting started. The engine of Mark's imported sedan was a low, self-satisfied hum, a sound that filled the space where conversation should have been. Outside the window, the world had bled into a watercolor smear of grey and faded green. Each mile marker we passed felt like a nail being hammered into a coffin lid. My coffin lid. He had insisted on driving, of course. "Let me handle everything, Elizabeth. You just relax." His words, like everything else about him, were coated in a thin, synthetic sweetness, like cheap air freshener, failing to mask something rotten underneath. I sat in the passenger seat, my hands folded over my worn leather handbag, a relic from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. I watched his hands on the steering wheel. They were smooth manicured, the hands of a man who sold things, houses, lives. He wore a watch that cost more than my first car, a gift from my daughter Sophia, a token of her affection or a down payment on her inheritance. The line had blurred so much over the years, it had vanished entirely. "Almost there," he said, his voice bright with forced cheer. He glanced at me, a quick bird-like movement, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. His eyes were busy, always busy. Calculating, appraising. Right now they were calculating how long it would take to get back to Willow Creek, to call the real estate photographer, to put the sign on the lawn. My lawn. I didn't answer. Silence had been my shield for 5 decades. My husband, David, had taught me its value. Silence was safe. Silence was agreeable. But now, sitting in this climate-controlled car on my way to be archived, I was beginning to understand that silence was also a form of consent. I had consented to a life lived in the margins, a life curated by a man who saw me as his most reliable, most private asset. And now I was consenting to be discarded by the children who had inherited his chilling pragmatism. The Evergreen Transit Station wasn't a station at all. It was a wound in the landscape. A single splintered wooden bench sat on a crumbling concrete platform, staring out at 2 parallel lines of rust that disappeared into an unforgivingly flat horizon. The building itself was boarded up, its windows like vacant eyes. A single flickering fluorescent light in the covered section of the platform cast a sickly, buzzing pallor on everything. It was a place for endings, a place where things were left to be forgotten. Mark pulled the car to a stop in the gravel lot. The hum of the engine died, and a profound, listening silence rushed in to take its place. It was the sound of abandonment. For a long moment, neither of us moved. He was waiting for me to get out. I was waiting for a lightning bolt to strike the car, for the earth to open up, for any sign from the universe that this wasn't really happening. The universe, it seemed, was as silent as I was. "Well, here we are," he said, finally unbuckling his seatbelt with a decisive click. He got out and opened the trunk, pulling out a single medium-sized suitcase. It was new. Sophia must have bought it. My old battered luggage, the pieces that had accompanied David and me on carefully orchestrated business trips, were probably already in a donation pile. Too much character. Too much history. He placed the suitcase on the gravel beside my door. He didn't open it for me. He just stood there, hands shoved in the pockets of his tailored trousers, jingling his keys. The sound was obscene in the quiet. Right then, Elizabeth. He walked around and opened my door, offering a hand that I ignored. I pushed myself out of the car, my joints protesting the cool, damp air. It smelled of wet earth and decay. He led me to the bench, placing the suitcase neatly beside it. He was always neat, orderly. It was part of the performance. The train comes at 4:15, straight through to the Silver Pines stop. Someone from the community will be there to meet you. He couldn't even say the name of the place without a slight hesitation, as if the lie tasted bad even to him. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thin paper ticket. He pressed it into my hand. My fingers, cold and stiff, closed around it. A one-way ticket. The finality of it was a physical blow, a punch to the sternum. This is for the best, Elizabeth. Truly. It'll be a new start for you. Quieter. Simpler. His gaze slid past my shoulder, focusing on the distant, empty tracks. He couldn't look at me. He couldn't face the reality of what he was doing. It was easier to look at the empty space where the future was supposed to be. He patted my shoulder, a gesture devoid of all warmth. Sophia sends her love. She's emotional about all this. Found it too difficult to come. I imagined Sophia at home scrolling through high-end furniture websites, picking out a new sofa for the living room she had just reclaimed. Her emotion was relief. Her difficulty was impatience. I should get going, he said already, backing away. Got a big meeting with a developer. You know how it is. He gave one last, tight smile. Be good, Elizabeth. And then he turned, walked briskly back to his car, and drove away without a backward glance. The red of his taillights bled into the grey dusk, and then vanished. The silence he left behind was different. It wasn't empty. It was full. Full of the buzzing of that single dying light. Full of the rustle of dead leaves skittering across the concrete. Full of the frantic, terrified beating of my own heart. I sat on that cold, hard bench, the one-way ticket still clutched in my fist, the new, anonymous suitcase standing guard beside me. I should have felt despair. I should have felt the crushing weight of loneliness. And for a moment, I did. I felt the abyss open up the yawning chasm of a life disposed of. I looked down at my hands, the skin thin as paper, the veins a roadmap of a long and difficult journey. These hands had soothed fevers, kneaded bread, held the hand of a dying man. They had silently recorded the sins of the powerful in a ledger only I could read. They were not the hands of a feeble old woman ready to be put out to pasture. A cold, clear thought cut through the fog of shock. It was sharp and hard as a diamond. He thinks this is an ending. He thinks this is my last stop. The ticket in my hand felt suddenly flimsy, insignificant. The suitcase beside me felt like a prop in a play I had no intention of starring in. I looked at the train tracks, stretching one way into the encroaching darkness. Then I turned my head and looked in the opposite direction, back down the gravel road Mark had just disappeared along. Back towards Willow Creek. Back towards my home. For me. The thought continued crystal clear and humming with a strange, unfamiliar power. This is the beginning. Slowly, deliberately, I stood up. My knees ached, but my spine was straight. I opened my hand and let the one-way ticket fall to the bench. It fluttered once, then lay still. I looked at the suitcase, a symbol of the neat, tidy life they had planned for me. I left it there, a monument to their breathtaking arrogance. Then I turned my back on the train tracks and began to walk. Each step on the loose gravel was a decision. Each breath of the cold, damp air was a reclamation. I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking towards everything. The scent of lilies was suffocating. It had permeated the entire house, a sweet, cloying perfume of grief that clung to the velvet curtains and seeped into the polished wood of the floors. It was the day after David's funeral, and the last of the black-clad guests had finally departed, leaving behind a wake of half-empty teacups and hushed condolences. The silence they left was heavy watchful. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I was in the study David's sanctuary, a room that still smelled more of him, of old paper leather and whiskey, than it did of the funereal flowers. I ran a hand over the back of his enormous wingback chair. 50 years. For 50 years, this house had been my world and my prison. David had designed it that way. Grand, beautiful, and utterly isolated. Now he was gone. But the walls still felt like they were listening. Sophia and Mark found me there. They came in together, a united front. Sophia, my only child, her face a carefully composed mask of sorrow. Mark, my son-in-law, his expression a blend of solemnity and barely concealed energy. He was practically vibrating with it. Mom Sophia said, her voice soft, practiced. She put her arm around my shoulders. It felt less like a comfort and more like a restraint. You shouldn't be in here. It's too much. Mark glided over to the mahogany desk, his fingers brushing against its gleaming surface. David kept this place immaculate, he said, his tone appreciative. It was the appreciation of an auctioneer, not a grieving family member. Solid wood. They don't make them like this anymore. They guided me from the study into the main living room, sitting me down on the sofa. It was a formal, staged intervention. Mark set his leather briefcase down on the coffee table and clicked it open. He pulled out a stack of glossy brochures, fanning them out like a poker hand. The logos were all gentle, reassuring. Silver pines, golden meadows, serene vistas, sanctuaries for the elderly and inconvenient. Mom, we need to talk about the future. Sophia began taking my hand. Her skin was soft, her nails perfectly manicured. We're worried about you. Here. All alone in this huge house. It's a lot of upkeep, Mark chimed in, tapping a brochure with a polished fingernail. The taxes alone are astronomical. And the market, Elizabeth, the market is at an absolute peak. We'd be foolish not to consider our options. Us options, not my options. I looked from my daughter's earnest, pleading face to my son-in-law's sharp, predatory one. They had rehearsed this. I could see it in the way they traded lines, the way Sophia would deliver the emotional appeal, and Mark would follow up with the practical financial logic. A perfectly executed pincer movement. Dad would have wanted you to be safe. Mom, Sophia said, her voice catching just enough to sound genuine. He wouldn't want you rattling around in here worrying about the boiler or the roof. These places, she gestured to the brochures, they have staff, nurses, activities. You could make friends. Friends. David had made sure I had no real friends. My life had been a closed loop, him, Sophia, and this house. He had curated my social interactions as meticulously as he curated his stock portfolio. The women I knew were the wives of his business associates' conversations limited to pleasantries over canapes at functions designed to further his own ambitions. Mark leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential man-to-man tone, as if we were co-conspirators in my own obsolescence. Look, Elizabeth, let's be practical. The equity tied up in this property is significant. Selling now would set you up for life. No more worries. We could invest the principal, and the returns would more than cover the costs of a top-tier facility like Silver Pines. You'd have the best care money can buy. His eyes, for a brief second, flickered past me up towards the hallway where the family portraits hung. His gaze lingered on the painting of my own parents, a heavy, ornate piece in a gilded frame. He wasn't looking at the painting. He was estimating its value. He was mentally appraising the Persian rugs, the grandfather clock in the hall, the silver service in the dining room. He was liquidating my life before I had even agreed to leave it. I saw it all with a sudden gut-wrenching clarity. This wasn't about my safety. This wasn't about what David would have wanted. This was about their impatience, their greed. They looked at me, and they didn't see a grieving widow, a mother. They saw a final obstacle, a gatekeeper sitting on their inheritance. The house wasn't a burden to me, it was a burden to them, an illiquid asset. And I, its current resident, was the only thing standing between them and a life of new cars, exotic vacations, and the social status they so desperately craved. The hungry gleam in their eyes was unmistakable. It was the look of wolves circling patiently, waiting for the old matriarch to finally fall. They thought his death had been the end of an era. They had no idea it was just the changing of the guard. To the town of Willow Creek, David Vance was a monument carved from granite. He was a shrewd investor, a philanthropist, who wrote generous checks to the hospital auxiliary, a pillar of the community, whose name was on a plaque in the library. He spoke with a quiet authority that people mistook for wisdom. His suits were impeccably tailored, his handshake was firm, his advice on the stock market sought after at every country club dinner. They saw the facade polished to a high sheen over 50 years. I saw the architect. Our marriage began with a promise of partnership and devolved so slowly I almost didn't notice into a masterclass in psychological warfare. It wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet. It was insidious. It was in the way he would correct a story I was telling at a dinner party, smiling indulgently as he said, "No, no, darling, you're remembering it all wrong." It was a Tuesday. It was in the way he handled all the finances, presenting me with a household allowance as if I were a favored employee, requiring a detailed accounting of every dollar spent. $112 for groceries? Elizabeth? Seems a little steep this week, don't you think? It was in the way he isolated me, subtly discouraging friendships that he deemed frivolous, or with people who weren't of our caliber. He didn't forbid them. He just made it so unpleasant, so awkward, that eventually the invitations stopped coming. He built the walls of my prison with bricks of love and concern, and for decades I believed him. I believed I was fragile. I believed I was flighty. I believed I needed his steady hand to navigate the world. The source of our wealth, the foundation upon which the Vance name was built, was not the stock market. David was a decent investor, but he wasn't a genius. His real genius lay in leverage, not financial leverage, but human leverage. He was a collector of secrets. His greatest investment wasn't in tech stocks. It was in the quiet, desperate sins of the powerful people of Willow Creek. An affair, a gambling debt, a business deal that skirted the edges of the law, a son's drug problem that was quietly made to disappear. David had an uncanny ability to sniff out weakness and a complete lack of scruples about exploiting it. His sophisticated blackmail operation was a work of art. It was never overt. There were no threatening letters, no clandestine meetings in dark alleys. It was a system of favors and investments. He would help a prominent judge with a delicate family matter. Months later, a zoning variance he needed for a property development would sail through the council unopposed. He would lend a struggling business owner a significant sum to avoid bankruptcy, and in return, he'd receive insider information that would lead to a windfall on a stock trade. It was a web of influence spun with threads of fear and obligation. He owned people. And the interest on his loans was their silence and their compliance. And I was his bookkeeper. I was the one person he trusted because he knew I was the one person who could never betray him. My complicity was his ultimate insurance policy. Late at night, in the leather-bound silence of his study, long after the rest of the house was dark, he would dictate his notes. He never wrote anything down. The risk was too great. The only ledger was my mind. Richard Sterling, he'd murmur, swirling a glass of scotch. Remember the name of that little motel off Route 9? The Blue Jay Inn, room 114. And the dates, second week of April last year. Or Judge Miller's son, Kevin. The incident at the university. The name of the girl was Sarah Perkins. The settlement was 50,000, paid from the charity fund. I was his living, breathing vault. I absorbed the sordid details of our town's elite, the names, the dates, the amounts. My mind became a library of quiet ruin, each memory, a toxic volume on a shelf. I never asked questions. I just listened, and I remembered. It was my function, my role in our meticulously constructed life. At first I was horrified. Then a strange numbness set in. It was the only way to survive. I compartmentalized. The woman who arranged flowers and planned dinner parties was not the same woman who memorized the architecture of other people's disgrace. His death from a sudden massive heart attack should have been a liberation. The warden was gone. The door to the prison was for the first time in 50 years unlocked. But as I stood there in the living room looking at the glossy brochures for my own containment, I realized I had been wrong. His death hadn't freed me. It had simply triggered a transfer of ownership. Mark and Sophia weren't building a new prison. They were just the new wardens eager to take control of the old one and its most valuable secret asset. They thought the house was the prize. They had no idea that the real inheritance, the true source of David's power, wasn't in the bricks and mortar. It was locked away safe and sound behind my quiet, unassuming eyes. Chloe was a product of her generation, which is to say, she seemed to communicate more with her thumbs than with her voice. My granddaughter, all of 18 years old, was a whirlwind of contradictions. She wore ripped black jeans and band t-shirts, but her eyes were old and startlingly observant. She was visiting a few days before my scheduled departure for Silver Pines, a visit orchestrated by Sophia to maintain the illusion of a caring family. Go say a proper goodbye to your grandmother Chloe. It's the right thing to do. Chloe sat curled in the armchair opposite me, her phone held in front of her face like a shield. She was scrolling through TikTok, the faint, tinny sound of viral videos, a constant buzzing underscore to the tension in the room. Mark was there, of course. He was helping me sort through some of Dad's things, which was his excuse to conduct a full inventory of the house's contents. He moved through the living room with a proprietary air, picking things up, examining them, and making quiet notes on his own phone. Now, Elizabeth, this silver set, he said, holding up a heavy, tarnished candlestick. It's beautiful, but terribly impractical. It'll fetch a nice price. I know a guy who specializes in estate silver. He spoke to me as if I were a child, his voice laced with a condescending patience that set my teeth on edge. We need to think about downsizing, clearing out the clutter, a fresh start. I murmured something non-committal, my gaze fixed on Chloe. She hadn't looked up from her phone, but I saw her thumb pause its endless scrolling. Her posture was still relaxed, but there was a new stillness about her. She was listening. Mark continued his monologue, moving from the silver to the collection of first edition books in the glass-fronted cabinet. And these books? Nobody reads physical books anymore, Elizabeth. It's all on a Kindle now. They're just dust collectors. We can digitize the important ones for you and the rest. Well, the collector's market is hot right now. Every word was a small act of erasure. He wasn't just clearing out a house. He was systematically dismantling a life, my life, rendering it down to its component sellable parts. Chloe's head was still bent over her phone, her dark hair falling across her face. But under the curtain of her hair, I saw her thumb swipe sideways, then tap the screen with a quiet, deliberate motion. A small red icon blinked once at the top of her screen before disappearing. She had just started a voice memo. An hour later, I was in the kitchen making tea. It was a futile gesture of domesticity in a house that no longer felt like my own. Mark had gone out to the garage to assess the storage situation. Sophia had called Mark's phone, and I could hear his voice drifting in through the open kitchen door, a low, smug rumble. I froze the kettle in my hand. Chloe appeared silently at my elbow, her own phone in her hand. She didn't look at me. She just stared at the screen, her face pale. She held it out slightly so I could see it. The red recording bar was still active. He was on speakerphone. "No, she's just sitting there looking like a lost bird," Mark was saying, and he laughed. It was a short, ugly sound. "Honestly, Soph, it's easier than I thought. She's completely out of it. Thinks I'm doing her a favor." Sophia's voice, tinny and distorted through the phone's speaker, replied, "Is she putting up a fight about any of it? The furniture, the paintings, a fight sweetheart. She hasn't had a fight in her in 50 years. David trained her like a show pony. She just does what she's told." I mentioned selling the silver, and she barely blinked. There was a pause. I could hear the clink of metal as he moved things around in the garage. She won't even know what hit her. By the time she figures out what the hell is going on from inside that depressing hellhole I'm shipping her to the house will be sold. The accounts will be cleared, and the money will be ours. Working for us. That Tesla isn't going to pay for itself, you know? Sophia giggled. It was a high, girlish sound that made my blood run cold. "Oh, you are terrible, Mark. Just make sure you get the power of attorney paperwork signed before she leaves." The one the lawyer drafted. The all-encompassing one. Already in my briefcase, he said, his voice oozing confidence. "I'll get her to sign it tomorrow when I take her through the final checklist. She'll think it's just for managing her pension. It's almost too easy. It's like taking candy from a very, very old baby." The call ended. Chloe's thumb moved, and the red bar vanished. Silence. She slowly lowered the phone, her knuckles white. She looked up at me, and for the first time, the detached, ironic teenager was gone. In her place was a young woman with a look of such profound fury and disgust in her eyes that it took my breath away. A deep, hollow pit opened in my stomach. Hearing it, knowing it was one thing, but hearing it confirmed in their own laughing, triumphant voices, filtered through the uncaring technology in my granddaughter's hand, was another. It was a violation. It wasn't just about money or a house. It was a coup. A quiet, bloodless coup against my very existence. Chloe didn't say a word. She just took a shaky breath, her eyes still locked on mine. In that shared, silent moment, an alliance was forged. She saw it. She understood. The phone in her hand wasn't just a device for entertainment. It was a weapon, and she had just loaded the first bullet. As she got up to leave a little while later, she walked past my chair, and her hand rested on my shoulder for just a second. The touch was light, but firm. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a promise. The clatter of thick ceramic on a Formica countertop was the first sound that truly registered. It was a solid, unambiguous noise in a world that had become a muffled hum of grief and betrayal. The diner was a pocket of fluorescent light carved out of the pre-dawn gloom, smelling of burnt coffee and bacon grease. For Elizabeth, it was a sanctuary. Miles and hours had passed since she'd walked away from the train station, a ghost leaving her own funeral. She had walked until her legs ached, then flagged down a long-haul trucker who asked no questions, his silence a strange, unexpected kindness. He'd dropped her here at this 24-hour oasis on a forgotten highway. She sat in a booth of cracked red vinyl, a cup of black coffee steaming in front of her. She hadn't touched it. Her hands were under the table, her fingers tracing the sharp, unfamiliar edges of a cheap plastic rectangle. A burner phone. She'd bought it 10 years ago, an impulse born from a moment of chilling clarity when she'd watched David on the phone, his voice a silken weapon destroying a man's reputation with a few well-chosen words. She'd realized then that David's world was a fortress, and every fortress needs a secret escape route. She'd hidden the phone still in its blister pack at the bottom of a box of old holiday decorations, a tool for a future she hoped would never come. Now it was here. Her fingers were stiff, clumsy as she tore open the packaging. The plastic crackled loud in the quiet diner. She inserted the battery, the SIM card. The small screen lit up stark and impersonal. No contacts, no history. A clean slate. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was it, the point of no return. For 50 years she had been a passenger in her own life, first in David's meticulously controlled vehicle, then in the one Mark and Sophia had prepared for her. Now she was taking the wheel. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the air thick with the smell of old frying oil. She closed her eyes and saw the number not as a memory, but as a brand seared into her mind. She'd recited it to herself every night for a decade, a secret rosary. She punched in the digits each press of a button, a final definitive severing of a thread to her past. It rang twice. A man's voice, calm and without inflection, answered. Yes, not hello, not a question, just an acknowledgement. It was exactly as she'd expected. Mr. Chen, this is Elizabeth Vance. Her own voice sounded strange to her, thin but steady. The name felt like a costume she was putting on for the first time. There was a pause on the other end, but it was not a pause of confusion. It was a pause of processing of files being retrieved from a mental cabinet. Mrs. Vance, I have been waiting for your call. Relief washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. He remembered. The arrangement made through a trusted third party years ago, a contingency for this very apocalypse, was real. My husband David is dead. I am aware, Chen said. His tone was not sympathetic. It was factual. I monitor the obituaries. My condolences on the circumstances. The circumstances. He already knew. Of course he did. It's time, she said the words, feeling momentous, heavy as stone. Understood, Chen replied. His voice was the auditory equivalent of a starched collar, crisp, professional, devoid of unnecessary texture. Where do we begin? There is a collection. Roman silver, 12 denarii, the Caesars. David kept them in a private vault at Sterling Mutual Bank in downtown Willow Creek. The account is under the name Marcus Aurelius. The key is in a magnetic case under the third bench from the entrance of Memorial Park, the one facing the fountain. She recited the information like a machine, the details a catechism she'd long since committed to heart. This was David's emergency fund, the untraceable nest egg for a disaster he never imagined would be his own death. I am familiar with the type, Chen said. Liquidating them without attracting attention will require finesse. It will take 48 hours to convert them to clean, untraceable capital. 48 hours, Elizabeth repeated. When you have the funds, meet me in Portland. The lobby of the Hotel de Luxe. Wednesday, 3 o'clock. I will be there, Chen said. One more thing, Mrs. Vance. What is the objective? Elizabeth looked at her reflection in the dark diner window. A woman she barely recognized stared back her face, a pale oval, her eyes dark with a purpose that was still taking shape. The objective, Mr. Chen, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a thread of steel running through it, is reclamation. She ended the call, removed the battery from the phone, and snapped the device in half with a sharp crack that made the lone cook at the grill look up from his newspaper. She laid the two pieces on the table beside the untouched coffee, a broken scepter. Then she stood up, walked to the counter, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she ordered breakfast. Meanwhile, 200 miles away, in the sun-drenched open-plan living room of Elizabeth's house, Mark Thompson was performing. He paced the gleaming hardwood floors, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice a rich, empathetic baritone. Absolutely, Catherine. We feel the same. It's a home, not just a house. It has a soul. Yes, 50 years of love baked right into the walls. Sophia and I are just, well, we're heartbroken to let it go, but Mom's health has to come first. Silver Pines is a wonderful facility, and she needs that round-the-clock care. It gives us peace of mind. Sophia, curled on the cream-coloured sofa that she'd always coveted, muted the video on her iPad, a tour of a Tuscan villa, and gave Mark a thumbs up. Her face was a mask of curated sorrow. Mark continued, his voice dropping conspiratorially. Look between us, the market is white hot. We've already had 3 informal inquiries. But you, Catherine, you're the best. We want this handled with class. We want a campaign that honours the legacy, the Vance estate. I like the sound of that. He listened, nodding, a smile playing on his lips. Perfect. The power of attorney documents are all signed and notarized. I'll have them messengered over this afternoon. Let's aim for an open house in 2 weeks. A showcase. Let's make it the event of the season. He hung up and let out a whoop of triumph, the performance melting away to reveal the raw, desperate glee beneath. She bought it hook, line, and sinker. 50 years of love baked into the walls. I should have been an actor. You are an actor, darling, Sophia said, unmuting her video. The sounds of a bubbling fountain filled the room. And you're brilliant. The Vance estate. It sounds like money. She swiped to a different tab, the Tesla configurator page. Should we go with the pearl white or the midnight silver? White, Mark said, instantly, walking over to the large picture window that overlooked the manicured gardens. His gardens now. It'll look better on Instagram. He looked out at the familiar landscape, but saw something new. He saw dollar signs. He saw freedom. For years he'd lived under David Vance's thumb, a sycophant, bound by a secret shame only David knew. He'd married Sophia, hoping to gain access to the Vance power, only to find himself a well-dressed servant. Now David was gone, and Elizabeth. Elizabeth was handled. It's finally over. He breathed, a profound sense of relief washing over him. No more begging for scraps. No more of him looking down his nose at me. We're in control now. We always should have been, Sophia said, her voice tight with resentment. It's our birthright. Mother never appreciated any of this. She just haunted this house like a ghost. It's better for her. She has people her own age now. Bingo nights. Jello. She said the word jello with a particular disdain, as if it were a synonym for irrelevance. Within a week, their lives transformed. The for sale sign, an elegant, custom-designed placard from Catherine's top-tier agency, went up on the lawn. A film crew arrived, their drones buzzing over the roof like metallic insects, capturing sweeping, cinematic shots of the property at sunset. Mark and Sophia posted the slickly produced video to their social media accounts. The video, set to an uplifting orchestral score, showed the house not as a home, but as a product, a lifestyle accessory. Sophia's Facebook page became a monument to their new, blessed life. There was a photo of them clinking champagne glasses on the patio, the caption reading, "To new chapters. So grateful for this beautiful life and the strength to make tough decisions for the ones we love." Family first. Vance estate. Blessed. Then came the photo of the new car, a gleaming pearl-white Tesla parked in the driveway where David's stately old Mercedes used to sit. Mark stood beside it, arm draped possessively over the roof. Finally joined, the 21st century hard work pays off. Tesla. Future is now. Success. They didn't notice the quiet hum of dissent in the comments section of the local news site that shared the real estate listing. Buried beneath the fawning praise were a few pointed questions. Didn't Mr. Vance just pass away? They're selling already. And, I thought Mrs. Vance loved that house more than anything. But Mark and Sophia didn't read those. They were too busy living their truth, a carefully constructed narrative of success and filial piety. They called Silver Pines once. A cheerful nurse informed them that Elizabeth was settling in, but was a very private person and wasn't taking calls. It was the perfect hassle-free answer. They felt a twinge not of guilt, but of vindication. She was fine. They were free. Their financial problems, a mounting pile of credit card debt, and a failed investment Mark had made, were about to be vaporized in the heat of the Willow Creek real estate market. They were safe. The air inside the bank vault was cold, dry, and silent. It smelled of metal and time. Elizabeth stood before a gleaming wall of stainless steel doors. Arthur Chen, looking less like a private investigator and more like a high-level executive in his tailored grey suit, stood beside her. He had been waiting for her in the hotel lobby exactly as promised, a sleek leather briefcase in his hand. He hadn't asked about her journey, her state of mind, or her plans. He simply said, "The funds have been secured and transferred to the accounts we discussed. What is the next step?" Now he handed a key to the bank employee, a prim woman who averted her eyes as she led them into the vault. Box 713, under the name Marcus Aurelius. Chen said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. The employee retrieved a long, heavy metal box and placed it on a narrow table in a private viewing room before discreetly withdrawing. For a moment, Elizabeth just stared at it. The last time she'd seen this box, David had been with her. He'd been showing her, instructing her. "If anything ever happens to me, Elizabeth, this is your severance, your parachute." He'd said it with a smirk, as if bestowing a great gift. She now understood it for what it was, hush money. "Mrs. Vance." Chen's voice was gentle but firm. She nodded her hands, surprisingly steady, as she unlocked the box. The lid lifted with a soft hiss. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was not what she expected. There were bearer bonds, thick stacks of them. There were bundles of cash, crisp $100 bills bound in paper bands. But at the very bottom, beneath the layers of anonymous wealth, was something else. A book. It was a ledger bound in dark green leather, the corners worn smooth with use. There was no title on the cover. It was heavy, dense. She lifted it out. It felt dangerous. She opened it to a random page. The handwriting was David's, small, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was a meticulous record of transactions, but the currency wasn't money. It was sin, names, dates, amounts, and then a coded notation. JH, re-offshore transfer discrepancy, 50K, resolved. Judge Miller, re-Vegas weekend 98, CM discretion assured. Councilwoman Peters, re-adoption records son, file 12B ongoing. Page after page, it was a catalogue of the town's hidden decay. Affairs, gambling debts, secret illnesses, financial crimes, buried scandals. David hadn't just been a shrewd investor. He had been a predator. He'd collected the secrets of Willow Creek's most powerful citizens and used them as collateral, building an empire of fear. This ledger wasn't a record of his wealth. It was the source of it. And she, his quiet, unassuming wife, had been his confidant. He'd talked to her about his business for years, using her as a sounding board, trusting her memory, never realizing he was loading a weapon and placing it in her hands. Her breath caught. She felt a wave of nausea, followed by a surge of ice-cold clarity. This was David's true legacy. Not the house, not the money. This book. this map of controlled ruin. Mr. Chen, she said, her voice a low hum. I need you to find information on a developer. His name is Richard Sterling. Chen, who had been observing her with detached professionalism, raised an eyebrow almost imperceptibly. Sterling Development is the biggest player in the valley. He's currently in partnership with your son-in-law to fast-track the permits for a multi-unit rezoning of your property. Elizabeth's fingers tightened on the leather cover. Of course. Mark wasn't just selling the house. He was selling its potential, its land, its soul. He was working with the biggest shark in the pond. She flipped through the ledger, her movements now quick and certain. S. Sterling, Richard. Her eyes scanned the entries, a litany of corrupt land deals, bribed inspectors, and leveraged politicians. And then she found it. An entry from 15 years ago. R.S. Miller Farms acquisition. Fire report 09. Witness statement suppressed. File 18C, paid in full. Miller Farms. A family-run farm that had bordered their property for generations. It had been destroyed in a mysterious fire ruled an accident. The Millers had been bankrupted, forced to sell their land for pennies on the dollar to an anonymous holding company. A holding company that a year later sold it to Richard Sterling for a massive profit. David had known. David had profited from it. He'd used it to control Sterling. Elizabeth looked up at Chen, and for the first time he saw something shift in her eyes. The quiet grief was gone, replaced by the hard, polished glint of forged steel. This isn't a parachute, Mr. Chen, she said, tapping the ledger. It's ammunition. It's a full arsenal. The glow of Chloe's phone cast long, dancing shadows on her bedroom walls. It was almost 2 a.m. The house was silent, but her mind was screaming. The audio file of her parents' conversation felt like a toxic object on her phone. Bingo nights, Jell-O, her mother's contempt. Elizabeth was handled. Her father's cold triumph. It was a poison she couldn't get out of her system. She felt a gnawing guilt. She should have said something. She should have screamed at them, confronted them. But she hadn't. She had frozen just like she always did, just like her grandmother had seemed to do for her entire life. But her grandmother hadn't frozen at the train station. She had walked away. The thought was a small, defiant spark in the darkness of Chloe's anxiety. She couldn't confront them. She didn't have the strength. Not yet. But she could do something. She opened TikTok. Her own account was a typical teenage wasteland of dance challenges and funny cat videos. This needed to be different, anonymous, untraceable. She created a new account, her fingers flying across the screen. The username came to her in a flash of inspiration, a Willow Creek Truths. Her first post was simple, almost crude. It was a black screen. For 60 seconds, the only thing that played was the audio she had recorded her parents' voices, distorted by a free app, making them sound deep and monstrous, like villains in a horror movie. Over the audio, white text appeared one line at a time. Ever wonder what good people say when they think no one is listening? Ever wonder what happens to the elderly when they become inconvenient? This is Willow Creek. Elder abuse, greed, what you don't see, truth. She posted it, her heart pounding. She threw her phone onto her bed as if it were on fire and squeezed her eyes shut. This was insane. No one would see it. Or worse, someone would figure out it was her. She expected maybe a dozen views from random bots. She was wrong. She woke up the next morning to 734 views and 52 comments. Most were confused. What is this? Is this a prank? But a few were different. This sounds familiar. There's a lot of this that goes on in this town. Emboldened, she decided to push further. She thought about what her dad had said about the house, about fast-tracking the sale with Richard Sterling. Sterling's name was everywhere in Willow Creek, plastered on construction sites and charity event banners. He was untouchable. Chloe spent the afternoon diving into the county's public records website, a skill she'd picked up from a true crime podcast obsession. She looked up land deals, permits, zoning changes. Her next video was more sophisticated. It was a series of quick cuts. A smiling picture of Richard Sterling at a charity gala downloaded from the newspaper's website. A screenshot of a county zoning permit for a new luxury condo development. A satellite image from Google Maps showing a swath of cleared forest. Over it, she put a menacing, low-frequency hum. The text was cryptic. The lungs of the valley, sold to the highest bidder. Some family trees grow in poisoned soil. Willow Creek Secrets. Richard Sterling. Follow the money. This one hit a nerve. The view count climbed into the thousands. The comments became more specific. That's the old woods behind my house. They pushed that rezoning through in a week. My uncle lost his job when Sterling bought out his company. A local nerve had been struck. That night, a notification popped up on her phone. A new direct message on her Willow Creek Truths account. The user was anonymous, a blank profile picture, the handle a random string of letters and numbers. The message was short. You're looking in the right direction, but at the surface. Look deeper. Chloe's blood ran cold. Who was this? She typed back. Who are you? The reply was instantaneous. A friend of the truth. Look into permit application 7B41 from 2018, the Miller Farms property. Cross-reference the official fire marshal's report with the date of the land title transfer to a holding company named Pine Ridge Investments. Chloe's hands were shaking. This was no longer a teenager venting online. This was something else. She spent the rest of the night digging, her fingers flying across the keyboard, fueled by caffeine and a growing sense of terrifying purpose. She found it all. The fire officially ruled an electrical fault, the Miller family's subsequent bankruptcy, the sale of their land for a fraction of its value to Pine Ridge Investments. And then, 6 months later, the sale of Pine Ridge Investments to Sterling Development, a shell company disappearing after a single transaction. Her next TikTok was a masterpiece of implication. It laid out the timeline using screenshots of the documents she'd found. It never explicitly said arson. It didn't have to. It just asked questions. Question. How does a family farm burn down the week before a crucial zoning vote? Question. Who is Pine Ridge Investments? Question. Why did one family's tragedy become a developer's windfall? Willow Creek Truths. Miller Farms. Justice for who? She posted it just after midnight. By morning, it had 10,000 views. It was being shared on local Facebook groups. The hashtag, Willow Creek Truths, was trending locally on Twitter. People were talking. Whispers were starting to coalesce into a roar. In her dark bedroom, bathed in the light of her phone, Chloe felt a thrill of power that was both intoxicating and terrifying. She had no idea who her anonymous source was. She had no idea that she was now a soldier in an army of two, taking orders from a quiet, meticulous man in a grey suit, who was himself taking orders from a woman a generation older, a woman who was sitting in a quiet hotel room, calmly mapping out the total annihilation of the world that had tried to erase her. The architect of ruin was drawing her blueprints, and the first tremors were already beginning to shake the foundations of Willow Creek. The champagne flutes in Mark and Sophia's hands were more than just glass. They were trophies. Each clink against a guest's glass was a small, satisfying sound of victory. The air in the house. Elizabeth's house was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, a cloying combination designed to mask the lingering scent of old memories and mothballs. Sophia, draped in a silk dress, the colour of cream, glided through the clusters of guests, her smile a carefully constructed masterpiece of warmth and grace. Mark was her shadow, his hand possessively on the small of her back, his suit impeccably tailored, his confidence radiating like heat off summer asphalt. They were the perfect hosts, the lords of a manor they had just conquered, the bones of this place. Mark was saying to Richard Sterling, the developer whose name was on half the new soulless constructions in Willow Creek. They're just incredible. David had a real eye, but it needs a modern touch, someone with vision. He gestured vaguely at the living room, at Elizabeth's worn armchairs and the heavy, dark wood furniture. His gesture was one of dismissal, of sweeping away the past. Sterling, a man whose face was a permanent mask of shrewd appraisal, nodded slowly. The lot size alone is the main draw. You could put a McMansion here that would block out the sun. People pay for that. He took a sip of his champagne, his eyes already calculating demolition costs and profit margins. Sophia drifted over to Judge Albright and his wife. "It's been so emotional, of course," she said, her voice a delicate tremor of feigned sadness. "Letting go of Mummy's house. But we knew she wouldn't be safe here alone anymore. Silver Pines is just a godsend. She's settling in so well, you know, making friends, painting." It was a beautiful lie, polished and smooth, and it slid easily into the ears of people who wanted to believe it. People who found the realities of aging and family conflict distasteful. Mrs. Albright patted Sophia's arm. "You're a good daughter, dear. A very good daughter." The murmur of conversation was a low, pleasant hum, the soundtrack to a successful transaction. It was the sound of Willow Creek's elite, the bankers and lawyers and business owners all gathered to witness the final respectable carving up of the Vance legacy. They moved through the rooms, admiring the high ceilings and the hardwood floors, their minds filled with thoughts of renovation, of tearing down walls, of erasing the woman who had lived within them for 50 years. Mark tapped a glass with his fork, a sharp, attention-grabbing ring. The chatter subsided. He stood near the grand fireplace, a triumphant smile playing on his lips. Sophia stood beside him, her hand linked in his. They looked like a power couple on the cover of a magazine. Friends, colleagues. Mark began, his voice projecting through the room. "Sophia and I just want to thank you all for coming today. This house holds a lot of history, a lot of memories." He paused, letting the fake sentiment hang in the air. "But as we all know, life is about moving forward. It's about embracing the future, building something new. And that's what this sale represents. A new chapter. For us, for the community, and for a new family that will hopefully fill these halls with as much life as we've known." He raised his glass. "So here's to new beginnings." The guests raised their glasses in response, a murmur of "hear, hear," and "to new beginnings" rippling through the crowd. And in that exact moment, as the toast was about to be completed, the heavy oak front door swung open. It didn't creak. It opened with a smooth, silent weight, as if pushed by an inexorable, unseen force. The sudden influx of cool evening air and the stark silence that followed it made every head turn. Standing in the doorway was Elizabeth. But it was not the Elizabeth they remembered. Not the frail, quiet widow who faded into the floral wallpaper of her own home. This woman stood tall, her posture immaculate. She wore a simple, elegant navy blue dress that skimmed her frame, making her look not just thinner, but stronger. Her silver hair was not in its usual tidy grandmotherly bun, but cut and styled in a chic modern sweep that framed a face that seemed younger. The lines of worry and resignation were gone, replaced by an unnerving, crystalline focus. Her eyes, clear and sharp, swept over the stunned faces in the room, missing nothing. Beside her, a half step behind, stood a man they did not know. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark, conservative suit, with a calm, watchful face that gave nothing away. He was built like a man who could move things or people out of the way without any effort at all. The silence in the room was no longer pleasant. It was a vacuum sucking all the air and bonhomie out of the space. Champagne flutes were frozen halfway to lips. Smiles curdled. Mark's arm raised for the toast, slowly lowered his face a mask of disbelief, then dawning horrified fury. Sophia's hand flew to her mouth, a small, choked gasp escaping. The champagne flute slipped from her other hand, shattering on the hardwood floor, with a sound that was obscenely loud in the total stillness. Elizabeth's gaze finally settled on her daughter and son-in-law. A small, enigmatic smile touched her lips, but it did not reach her eyes. She took a step forward, her sensible heels clicking with quiet authority on the floorboards of her home. Mark. Sophia, she said, her voice perfectly level, carrying across the silent room with the clarity of a bell. It seems you've started the party without me. She gestured to the man beside her. Please, everyone. Don't let me interrupt. This is my associate, Mr. Chen. He's my new asset manager. The words hung in the air, each one a stone dropped into a placid pond. Asset manager, not caregiver, not friend. The implication was immediate financial and utterly terrifying. The polite fiction of the concerned family caring for their dotty old mother had just been vaporized. The wave of shock that had silenced the room now solidified into something much colder, much heavier, a shared, unspoken dread. Mark and Sophia stood frozen, their faces pale canvases of horror. Elizabeth ignored them. Her gaze swept past them, locking onto Richard Sterling, who was trying to subtly edge his way toward the back of the room. She glided toward him, her movements fluid and purposeful. Mr. Chen remained by the door, a silent, unmovable sentinel. Richard Elizabeth said, her voice warm, almost conspiratorial. Sterling flinched, as if she'd struck him. So good to see you. I was just thinking about you the other day, remembering all the time you and David used to spend downstairs. She gestured gracefully toward the hallway that led to the basement. You remember, don't you, David was so proud of the work he did on that room, had it completely soundproofed. She paused, letting her eyes hold his. He said it was vital for sensitive negotiations, to ensure complete privacy. Sterling's face, usually ruddy with confidence, had gone a blotchy, unhealthy white. He managed a strangled noise that might have been a laugh. Ah, yes. David. Always the perfectionist with his hobbies. He took a step back, bumping into a small end table and nearly knocking over a lamp. Elizabeth's smile was serene. She was not accusing him of anything. She was simply reminiscing. But every person in that room who knew both David Vance and Richard Sterling understood the unspoken threat. They knew Sterling's first major development deal had mysteriously cleared a dozen zoning hurdles after a private meeting with David. The soundproof room was not for hobbies. It was for leverage. She turned away from the petrified developer before he could formulate a response, her eyes scanning the crowd like a hawk seeking its next target. They landed on Judge Albright, who was attempting to look fascinated by a landscape painting on the wall, his back mostly to her. Judge Albright, she called out, her tone sweet as honey. The judge stiffened, but had no choice but to turn a pained, formal smile plastered on his face. Elizabeth. What a surprise. Isn't it? She replied brightly. I was just telling Sophia how much I've been thinking about the past. About this house, about my David's many passions. She took a step closer to the judge, her voice dropping slightly, forcing him and those nearest to lean in. I'm sure you remember my husband's impressive collection of art. She let the word hang in the air for a beat too long. Some of it was quite rare. truly one-of-a-kind pieces. The judge's smile became a rigid rictus. His wife's hand tightened on his arm. The art collection was a town legend among a certain circle. It wasn't paintings or sculptures. It was a collection of photographs, compromising photographs of a much younger Judge Albright, taken during a business trip to Reno 2 decades ago, a trip that coincided with a very favorable ruling in a case involving one of David's associates. The art was the reason the judge had a career. It was also the reason David Vance had never seen the inside of a courtroom. The festive atmosphere had not just curdled, it had died and was beginning to decay. The air was thick with paranoia. Guests were no longer looking at the house. They were looking at each other, wondering what secrets David Vance had known about them. The polite hum of conversation had been replaced by a tense, suffocating silence, punctuated by the nervous clearing of throats and the shifting of feet. People began to find urgent, unspoken reasons to be elsewhere. A hand was checked for a non-existent text message. A spouse was given a sharp, meaningful look. Elizabeth continued her slow, deliberate tour of her own damnation. She stopped by a banker, patting his arm. Mr. Gable. I do hope your son is doing well at that new preparatory school. It must be so expensive. David always said a good education was the best investment a man could make, no matter the cost, or the source of the funds. Mr. Gable looked as though he might be sick on the Persian rug. Each comment was a perfectly aimed dart, tipped in poison, delivered with the gentle smile of a benevolent grandmother. She wasn't revealing the secrets. She was simply holding up a mirror, showing them the secrets were known. She was reminding them that while the king was dead, the queen still remembered where every body was buried. The ledger wasn't just a book. It was a ghost, and she had just summoned it into the room. Finally, the dam of Mark's composure broke. He strode toward her, his face a thunderous mask of rage and humiliation. The last of the guests were already scurrying out the door, eager to escape the blast radius. Only Sterling and the judge remained trapped by the sheer gravity of their own exposure. That's enough. Mark hissed, his voice low and shaking with fury. He grabbed her arm. What do you think you're doing? You're making a scene. You've lost your mind. Elizabeth didn't flinch. She looked down at his hand on her arm, her expression turning from serene power to one of pure, glacial contempt. Get your hand off me, Mark. Her voice was so cold, it seemed to lower the temperature in the room. He recoiled, as if burned. You are not welcome here. He snarled, trying to recover to reassert the dominance he thought he owned. This is my house now. I have power of attorney. I am in control. Is that so? Elizabeth said calmly. At that moment, Mr. Chen stepped forward from his post by the door. He moved with an unnerving, silent efficiency. In his hand was a crisp, folded legal document. He didn't hand it to Mark. He held it out, a formal offering. Mark stared at it, as if it were a snake. What is this? He demanded, his voice cracking. It is? Elizabeth said, her voice ringing with finality, a legally executed and filed revocation of your power of attorney. Effective as of 9 a.m. this morning. You have no authority here, Mark. You have no control. You are merely a guest. And your invitation has just been rescinded. Mr. Chen placed the document firmly in Mark's unresisting hand. Sophia, who had been watching from the fireplace like a statue, let out a sound, a high, thin wail of pure despair. Elizabeth turned to the few remaining horrified onlookers. Her voice was strong, clear, and projected to every corner of the now empty room. I want to thank you all for coming, she announced, as if this had been her party all along. But I'm afraid there has been a change of plans. I won't be selling this house. She paused, letting the statement land. Instead, she continued, her voice imbued with a righteous fire. I have been in contact with several charitable foundations. We are in the process of turning this property into a shelter, a safe haven for women and children escaping domestic abuse. This house, which has known its own share of silence and control, will now become a place of safety and new voices, a place of freedom. The pronouncement was a masterstroke. It was not just a negation of Mark and Sophia's plans, it was a moral judgment delivered publicly. She wasn't just taking back her house, she was sanctifying it, turning their greedy ambitions into a sordid footnote in a story of redemption. Richard Sterling and Judge Albright stared, their own selfish concerns momentarily forgotten in the face of this stunning reversal. Mark looked from the legal document in his hand to his mother-in-law's implacable face. The fury drained out of him, replaced by a desperate, sputtering confusion. You can't do that. The money. My money. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. The last vestiges of warmth, however feigned, vanished, leaving behind something as hard and unforgiving as granite. Money? She repeated the word, tasting like ash in her mouth. Was that all this was ever about for you? An inheritance? She reached into the small, elegant clutch she was carrying and pulled out a single laminated page. It was a photocopy, crisp and clear. She didn't hand it to him. She slid it across the smooth, cold marble of the kitchen countertop, the same countertop where she had served him countless family dinners. It stopped directly in front of him. "You wanted your inheritance, Mark," she said, her voice a blade of ice. "This is it." He looked down. His eyes scanned the page. It was a page from a ledger, the handwriting neat and precise. David's handwriting. There were dates, names, figures. But it was the narrative text beneath the numbers that made the blood drain from Mark's face. His skin turned a waxy ashen grey. His jaw went slack. The document revoking his power slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor, forgotten. The page detailed a crime, a vile, ugly secret from decades ago, not about David, but about Mark's own father. It detailed how David Vance had discovered the secret, how he had acquired the proof, and how he had used that knowledge to control Mark's father, and by extension, Mark himself, for years. It was the reason Mark had access to the country club, the reason he'd gotten his first job, the reason he'd felt perpetually indebted and inadequate. It was the hidden, rotten foundation of his entire life. David hadn't been a mentor. He had been a blackmailer. "This is your legacy," Elizabeth said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "Not money, not this house. The truth. The filth that you were built on. That is what David left you. That is your inheritance." Mark stared at the paper, his hands trembling violently. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. His entire world, his perception of his father, of himself, had been shattered by a single piece of paper on a kitchen counter. Sophia finally moved, stumbling toward him. "Mark, what is it? What does it say?" She pleaded, her voice choked with tears. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He was a man hollowed out. As Mark stood there, a ghost in the ruins of his own life, a phone buzzed. It wasn't in the room. The sound was faint, coming from outside, from the driveway. It was Chloe's phone. Sitting in her beat-up Honda, parked down the street, she watched the screen, her heart pounding. The TikTok she had posted just 10 minutes ago was exploding. The video was a work of brutalist art. It started with the crystal-clear, damning audio she had recorded of Mark and Sophia. "She'll be safe and sound at Silver Pines, completely out of the way. Once the house is sold, the mortgage is paid, the Tesla is ours. She has no idea. She's too old to understand." Overlaid on their smug voices was stark white text on a black screen. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact information fed to her by her anonymous benefactor, the one Arthur Chen had put her in touch with. Developer. Richard Sterling's Willow Creek Lux project was approved by the City Zoning Board on June 12, 2023. The vote was 3-2. The deciding vote was cast by Councilman Greg Pierce on June 14, 2023. A deposit of $50,000 was made to a shell corporation, Skyview Holdings, LLC, registered to Pierce's brother-in-law. The source of the funds, an account controlled by David Vance. The video had hit the Willow Creek social media ecosystem like a lightning strike. 10,000 views, 50,000, 100,000. It had broken containment. Shares on Twitter, screenshots on Facebook groups. The local whispers had become a regional shout. Then her phone buzzed again. A news alert from a national outlet. Corruption scandal rocks affluent town of Willow Creek, implicating prominent developer and local officials. Viral video by account Willow Creek Truths ignites firestorm. Chloe looked up from her phone. In the distance, she could see them. The first set of headlights turning onto the street. They were moving too fast to be residents. They had the look of purpose, of hunger. Behind them, another set. News vans. The scandal was no longer a local secret. It was a national headline. The fire wasn't just coming. It was already here. And Elizabeth Vance's house, soon to be a shelter, a testament to survival, was at the absolute burning epicenter. The digital storm that followed the open house was of a different nature than the physical one that had gathered and broken that afternoon. The news vans with their satellite dishes and eager reporters had eventually packed up and left Willow Creek, their hunger for scandal momentarily satiated. But online, the fire didn't just burn, it multiplied. It was a blaze fed by screenshots, by forwarded emails, by the endlessly looping TikTok video Chloe had posted, a digital ghost that now haunted every screen in town and far beyond. For Mark and Sophia, their home, the one they had tried to steal, became a gilded cage. The silence inside was a thick, suffocating blanket, punctuated only by the ping of notifications, each one a fresh delivery of public scorn. Mark sat on a leather ottoman he'd bought a week ago, a monument to his own hubris. His phone, which had been his scepter of power, was now an instrument of torture. It buzzed against the polished wood of the coffee table. He stared at it, the caller ID flashing a name that made his stomach clench. James Roth, CEO. His boss. He knew what this was. He'd been rehearsing the conversation in his head for 2 days, a frantic script of denials and deflections. But when he finally answered, his voice was a dry croak. Mark. James Roth's voice was flat stripped of its usual backslapping bonhomie. There was no, "How are you?" no preamble. Just a cold, hard finality. "We're letting you go, effective immediately. Your access has been revoked. HR will be in touch about your final paycheck and the return of company property." Mark opened his mouth, a desperate James wait forming on his lips, but it was useless. "Don't, Mark." Roth cut him off. "Just don't. We've been fielding calls from Richard Sterling's legal team all morning. They're suing you for fraudulent misrepresentation and breach of contract. They're suing the firm for damages. The reputational harm, it's catastrophic. You didn't just lie to a client, Mark. You tried to build a career on a foundation of elder abuse and fraud, and you brought our name down with you. We're done." The click was deafening. Mark didn't move. He just held the dead phone to his ear, the silence on the other end, a verdict. A moment later, a new email notification popped up on his screen. The subject line was stark: "Legal notice, Sterling Development versus Mark Thompson." He didn't need to open it. He knew what it contained. Ruin. Complete and utter ruin. He'd flown so close to the sun, convinced of his own brilliance, only to find the wings he'd fashioned were made of wax, melted not by the sun, but by the quiet, simmering heat of an old woman he had dismissed as irrelevant. Sophia watched him from the doorway of the kitchen. Her face, usually a carefully curated mask of contentment for her social media followers, was pale and drawn. The designer clothes she wore seemed to hang off her like a costume for a part she could no longer play. Was that? She began, her voice thin. It was, Mark said, his voice hollow. He tossed the phone onto the sofa. Fired. Sued. Sterling is coming after everything. He looked up at her, and for the first time, the charming, ambitious mask he wore for her for everyone was gone. In its place was a raw, ugly bitterness. This is your fault. Sophia flinched as if struck. My fault. My fault. You were the one who cooked this up. You were the one whispering in my ear about the commission, about how we deserved this. You were the one who drove her to that station, and you were the one who couldn't wait to get her hands on the money. He shot back, rising to his feet. His body thrummed with a toxic energy, a frantic need to place the blame anywhere but on himself. You and your aspirational lifestyle. The Tesla is still in the driveway, Sophia, the one we can't afford. The one you posted all over Instagram like you were some kind of tech mogul's wife. Leveling up. Wasn't that what you called it? Look at us now. We're leveled all the way down to the bottom. He gestured wildly around the living room at the new furniture, the abstract art they'd bought. All this, it's not ours. It was never ours. It was a fantasy built on your greed and my weakness for it. My greed. She shrieked, the sound echoing in the cavernous room. You were the real estate shark, Mark, the one who saw the dollar signs. I just wanted my mother to be safe. I thought she was declining. Oh, stop it. Mark laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Just stop lying, at least to me. You didn't see a declining old woman. You saw an obstacle. You saw a living, breathing roadblock between you and your inheritance. You complained for years that your father left everything to her. You felt entitled to it. Don't you dare pretend this was about her safety. The truth spoken so bluntly hung between them ugly and undeniable. It poisoned the air, turning their shared dream into a shared nightmare. The blame game was just a frantic dance to avoid looking at the reflection of their own character. Sophia's face crumpled. The anger drained away, replaced by a desperate, panicked fear. What are we going to do? We'll lose the house. We'll lose everything. Her eyes darted around the room as if the walls were closing in. My friends. They're not answering my calls. My posts. People are leaving comments. Horrible, horrible comments. She pulled out her own phone, her thumb shaking as she scrolled. They're calling me a monster. A thief. Mark just stared at her, his expression devoid of sympathy. Welcome to the club, he said flatly. Your 15 minutes of fame came with a price. A sudden, desperate idea lit Sophia's eyes. Mom. I have to call Mom. I have to explain. She can stop this. She can tell them it was a misunderstanding. She has to. It was the plea of a child, a regression to a time when her mother was the fixer of all problems, the source of all comfort. She had spent the last year treating her mother like a burden, and now in her moment of ruin, she saw her as a savior. She fumbled with her phone, her fingers clumsy, and found Elizabeth's number in her contacts. She pressed the call button and held the phone to her ear, her breath held tight in her chest. Mark watched her, a cynical, weary look on his face. He already knew. Sophia's expression shifted from desperate hope to confusion, then to pure, unadulterated panic. She pulled the phone away from her ear and stared at the screen, then put it back. It's not ringing. She listened again, her knuckles white as she gripped the device. Then she lowered it slowly, her eyes wide and vacant. A recording, she whispered. It just plays a recording. What does it say? Mark asked, though he didn't need to. Sophia's voice was barely audible, the words falling like stones into the silence of the room. The number you have dialed has been disconnected. Please check the number and try again. She didn't try again. She knew. It wasn't just a phone line that had been cut. It was a lifeline, a history, a possibility of forgiveness. Elizabeth hadn't just walked away from the train station. She had walked away from them completely and irrevocably. She had untethered herself, and in doing so had left them adrift in the storm they had created. They stood there in the silent house, surrounded by the trappings of a life they had tried to steal, a life that had now crumbled to dust around them. They had lost the house. They had lost the money. They had lost their reputations. But the most profound loss, the one that echoed in the sterile silence left by the disconnected call, was the loss of any semblance of who they once were. They were left with nothing but each other, and the toxic, suffocating truth of their own greed. The whispers that had once filled the house, planning and plotting their ascent, were gone, replaced by a silence that screamed their failure. The metallic, emotionless voice of the telephone operator. The number you have dialed has been disconnected, faded not into silence, but into a different, more powerful sound. It was the sound of rushing water, of wind, moving over an endless expanse, the deep, rhythmic roar of the Pacific Ocean. The transition was seamless, a journey from a closed, suffocating room to an open, liberating vista. Miles away, and a world apart, Elizabeth Vance stood before a large picture window in a small, light-filled apartment on the Oregon coast. The late afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them into a cascade of tiny golden stars. The apartment was simple, furnished with a comfortable armchair, a small wooden table, and shelves filled with books, not trinkets. There was nothing of her old life here. No heavy mahogany, no oppressive portraits, no ghosts in the corners. The only art on the wall was the ever-changing masterpiece framed by the window, the grey-blue sea meeting the pale sky. She held a warm cup of jasmine tea in her hands, its fragrant steam rising to meet her. She wasn't gone in the sense of being lost. She was found. The process had been methodical, executed with the quiet precision of Arthur Chen. A week after the open house in a sterile anonymous office in downtown Portland, they had sat across from each other at a plain metal desk. Between them lay David's ledger. It felt heavy, not just with the weight of its paper and leather binding, but with the decades of secrets it held. Arthur had set up a secure, encrypted laptop. "Are you certain, Elizabeth?" He had asked, his voice gentle, but his eyes serious. "Once this is sent, there is no taking it back. It will set off a firestorm." Elizabeth had looked from the book to the screen. She thought of the faces at the open house, the smug confidence of Richard Sterling, the casual corruption of the judge, the web of favors and threats that had choked the life out of her town and her own life for 50 years. A firestorm, she thought, was exactly what was needed. Sometimes you have to burn the old growth to the ground to let the sunlight reach the forest floor. "I am certain, Arthur," she said, her voice clear and steady. She placed a hand on the ledger, a final symbolic touch. "It's not my story to keep. It never was." With a series of quiet clicks, Arthur Chen attached the scanned files to an anonymous email addressed to a special investigative unit within the FBI. He hit send. There was no fanfare, no dramatic sound effect, just a small on-screen notification. "Your message has been sent." With that single quiet act, a system of corruption that had thrived in the shadows for half a century began to unravel. It was a silent digital purge, orchestrated from the quiet of an unremarkable office, dismantling David's legacy one encrypted packet at a time. Now, watching the waves crash against the shore, Elizabeth felt a profound sense of lightness. It wasn't the giddy thrill of victory, but the deep, soul-settling peace of a long-overdue task completed. She had spent her life as a keeper of secrets. Now, she was free of them. She sat down at the small wooden table and opened her laptop. It was an old model, simple and functional. She had no interest in the latest technology. She only needed it for two things: to read the news and to check her email. There was one new message in her inbox. The sender was Chloe T. A small, warm smile touched Elizabeth's lips. She clicked it open. The message itself was brief, almost telegraphic in its simplicity, yet it carried more weight than a 1,000-page novel. Subject: thinking of you. Hi, Grandma. I moved out, starting some classes at the community college early just to get a head start. It's quiet, but a good quiet. I started a new blog, just for my own stuff, my own thoughts, no more secrets. Thank you. I don't think I understood everything back then when this all started, but I do now. Thank you for showing me how to be strong. Love, Chloe. Below the text was a single link. Elizabeth clicked on it. It took her to a simple, clean web page with the title, Just Chloe. There was one post titled, Finding My Own Voice. It was a short, thoughtful piece about authenticity, about the difference between the person you perform for your family and the person you really are. It was the work of a young woman stepping out of the shadow of her parents and into her own light. Elizabeth closed the laptop. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of a deep, quiet joy. The inheritance she had truly wanted to leave behind wasn't a house or a bank account. It was this. It was the spark of strength she had passed on to her granddaughter. Chloe hadn't just recorded a conversation. She had listened. She had learned. She was breaking her own cycle, choosing her own path, finding her own voice. That was a legacy that could never be squandered or sold. That was a legacy that would grow. She turned her gaze back to the ocean, to the endless, rhythmic cycle of the waves. The tide was coming in, washing the sand clean, erasing the footprints of the day, preparing the shore for a new morning. Looking out at the vast, churning expanse of the Pacific, Elizabeth finally understood the true nature of her plan. Her revenge was never about the money. The millions David had amassed through blackmail and fear were a tainted inheritance, a currency of misery. To have kept it would have been to remain tethered to him, to his methods, to his memory. Instead, she had used it as a weapon against its own source. With Arthur's help, she had used the corrupt money to systematically destroy the corrupt system David had built. The funds were used to pay for the investigation, for the legal architecture of the anonymous leak, for the quiet dismantling of accounts and shell corporations. It was a kind of financial alchemy, turning dirty money into an agent of purification. The substantial remainder, a fortune that could have bought her a life of unimaginable luxury, was donated. Anonymously. It was funneled through a dozen charitable trusts, vanishing into funds for women's shelters, legal aid societies, and scholarships for underprivileged students. The money was now where it could do some good, its sordid origins erased by its new purpose. Her revenge was never about wealth, it was about erasure. It was about erasing David's name from the town's list of benefactors and exposing him for the predator he was. It was about erasing the smug, self-satisfied smirk from Mark Thompson's face, replacing it with the cold, hard reality of consequence. It was about erasing the shallow, greedy ambition in her daughter Sophia, forcing her to confront the barrenness of a life built on entitlement. But most of all, it was about erasing the woman she had been forced to be for 50 years. The quiet, accommodating, invisible woman who recorded sins in her mind but never spoke of them. The woman who kept the peace by sacrificing her own. The woman who had mistaken subservience for love and silence for safety. She had killed that woman not with a weapon, but with a choice. The choice to act. The choice to speak. The choice to walk away. She thought of the silence in the Willow Creek house. It had been an oppressive, heavy thing. A silence born of fear, of unspoken resentments, of secrets festering in the dark. It was the silence of a tomb where lives were buried long before bodies were. Every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the grandfather clock had only emphasized the profound lack of honest sound of genuine life. Here on the coast, there was a different kind of silence. It was a vast, elemental roar. The crashing of the waves, the cry of the gulls, the hiss of the wind. It was a sound so immense and constant that it became a form of peace. It was the sound of nature indifferent to human drama, a sound that washed over you and cleaned you out. It didn't demand anything from her. It didn't judge her. It simply was. Her triumph wasn't in the downfall of her enemies. Watching them burn had offered a fleeting, bitter satisfaction, but it wasn't the source of her peace. Her peace came from the aftermath, from the quiet that followed the storm she had unleashed. It came from the knowledge that she had finally, after a lifetime of being an object in someone else's story, David's dutiful wife, Sophia's inconvenient mother, become the author of her own. She took a slow, deep breath, filling her lungs with the salty air. The oppressive silence of the house in Willow Creek was a prison. This roaring silence of the ocean was freedom. Her final thought was not of victory, not of revenge, not even of her family. It was a simple, profound realization that settled over her like the evening mist rolling in over the water. The loudest thing in the world, she thought to herself, a quiet smile gracing her lips, is the silence you choose for yourself. What Elizabeth chose in the end wasn't revenge, but freedom. She erased a legacy of control to write a new story of liberation. What parts of your own life are you choosing to write? Share a story in the comments about a time you chose your own path, no matter how difficult. Let's create a community of strength, one story at a time. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, share this story with them. Let them know they are not alone.